Hi, my name is Craig Lewis, and I am submitting a research proposal today. My topic for my research proposal is educator self efficacy for using social emotional learning, or SEL, to mitigate aggression in the classroom. Part of the reason that I want to do this study is because of my current role. I am an elementary school counselor, and I also teach one of our specialized classes as a social emotional learning classroom. So that got me thinking about the push for SEL in our country. In the last couple of years, there's been a huge push for more social emotional skills being taught in the classroom, and part of that is to mitigate things like bullying and aggression. What I've seen is that teacher expectations have also increased a lot in the last couple of years, and many feel unprepared to implement some of these strategies, and that further training is needed. Aggression can be shown in a couple of ways. The most common that I saw were proactive and reactive. Proactive would be more premeditated or more intentional, thinking about getting back at somebody, that kind of thing. Whereas reactive is more in the moment. You hurt me, I hurt you. That kind of reactionary aggression is one of the other ways that we've seen. Aggression is also sometimes normalized in schools, which that isn't great, especially when it is done by teachers. Aggression is an attempt to increase or protect status or decrease the status of others. So we understand where aggression comes from. It is an attempt to gain or protect our current status socially or decrease the status of others in hopes to increase our own. Aggression is shown across genders, though boys are more likely to show outward aggression and aggression overall, both proactive and reactive. It's also experienced by a vast majority of students. I've seen numbers as high as 87% of students experience some type of aggression while in school. That being said, skills like self control, gratitude, empathy, and forgiveness can lower incidents of aggression. Many social emotional learning programs have these skills built into their curriculum, so that is why we are looking at social emotional learning. School climate and classrooms have an effect on aggression. If students are in a school or a classroom where aggression is more accepted, and unspoken accepted, or students see others being aggressive and not having any consequences for that, they're more likely to do that. Um, so that's why it's important to have school climates and classrooms that are cognizant of aggression and what that looks like. Teacher implementations of social emotional skills do have an effect on mitigating aggression. A lot of the literature says that even if teachers that are implementing these skills in their curriculum and being consistent throughout, it does have an effect on mitigating some of that aggression. Um, Teachers are able to implement these skills with fidelity when trained, especially when trained from a trauma informed approach. When we take it from a trauma informed approach, that solidifies and increases the efficacy of those social emotional skills. Ultimately, increases in aggression have a positive correlation with social maladjustment, which is something that we need to be able to recognize as educators and recognize that that is not something that we should be promoting first, and something that we should be taking an active role in trying to mitigate if we are able to. So, the purpose of this study is to examine whether elementary teachers feel more prepared to mitigate aggression in their classrooms with SEL skills after a professional development. So, this study will utilize a pre and post test measure to determine whether the online training has had an effect on elementary teachers' feeling of self efficacy to mitigate aggression in the classroom. We want this training to give teachers a better idea of what aggression looks like. We want them to understand the background on aggression, long term effects of aggression for both the aggressor and the victim. And finally, we'll teach them evidence based skills to mitigate that aggression. That includes things like self control and empathy. Those were two of the biggest ones that I saw in the literature. So, this training will not only tell them the effects of those two things, self-control and empathy, but also how to implement that in the classroom and what to look for as signs of aggression, and being able to use those skills to mitigate some of that. This study has been decided as an online training for convenience of the teachers, and it can be done at any time. This study will also use the data from surveys for regression analysis as we're testing variables for the correlation. We want to see if that training does have an effect. My research question is: does a professional development on implementing social emotional skills aimed at aggression make elementary teachers feel more prepared to mitigate these aggressions? My null hypothesis is professional development has no effect on preparing elementary teachers to implement social emotional skills to mitigate aggression in classrooms, controlling for current SEL in schools. This is an important element to me. As I said earlier, there has been a huge push for social emotional learning in schools. So I want to factor in for that, or I want to account for that factor of whether there's already a social emotional learning going on in the schools, whether it is a special like mine, which I also realize that that is kind of a rarity, um, or if it's through social emotional lessons that are being taught at a grade level or in the classroom by each teacher, if it's only certain grades. I want to make sure that I account for any social emotional learning that's going on currently in the schools. The instruments I'll be using is a demographic questionnaire. This will be general information about the participants, such as what grade level they've taught or they're teaching at, whether their school is in a rural or urban environment. And I also want to see how long the teachers have been teaching. The most important variable that I'm interested in is, again, whether there's SEL implementation already in place in their school, if I need to, or if the research is skewing certain ways. I have the other demographic information to pull and see if there's additional variates for or covariates based on that demographic information. I'll also use the general self-efficacy scale. This is a short 10-item scale with a 4-point Likert scale. It is correlated with emotion, optimism, and work satisfaction. So my hope is that using this scale as a pre and post measure will help to show what I'm looking for. It is a very reliable assessment. It has a Chromebox alpha between 0.76 and 0.90. For Chromebox alphas, you want the number to be anywhere from 0 to 1, with the number being closest to 1 as possible. So since we have a 0.76 and a 0.90, it's a very reliable instrument. The total score is what you'll get at the end. It should be between 10 and 40, and that indicates the level of self-efficacy, with higher scores indicating higher levels of self-efficacy. So our hope is that we see lower scores at the beginning and then higher scores after the training. As far as data collection, we'll be using a convenience sample. The training opportunity will be offered through professional organizations, such as the National Education Association, our local organizations, or the state level organizations, such as, for me, I'm in Pennsylvania, so I'd be looking at PSEA. Um, Participants must be teachers who are currently teaching in the elementary classroom setting. This is important to factor in any teachers who are retired and subbing, or student teachers, or teachers who are currently on some type of leave. We don't want to test those people because they're not currently in the classroom. For our data analysis piece, we're going to be using an ANCOVA to review the research and the null hypothesis. Our findings will be based on a 0.05 error. We will be using a one-way ANCOVA because we have one factor and one covariant that we are testing for. Now, that is the plan, but if our data is showing something interesting, we could add another covariate based on that demographic information, such as, how many years of teaching or whether schools are in an urban or rural environment. But for the purpose of this research proposal, I only added in one covariant of current SEL implementation, a factor being professional development, and our response variable being teacher self efficacy. I'll be using the JASP program to determine the level of significance, including effect size, Levene's test, and regression of the slopes. Using these tests, we'll either reject or fail to reject our null hypothesis. We also have Tukey Bonferroni on backup as post hoc tests if the assumptions are violated. What we expect to find from this study is we expect to reject the null hypothesis and prove that there is a relationship between professional development and feeling prepared to implement social emotional skills to mitigate aggression. So, again, we want to see an increase in self efficacy after the training. We expect to see an increase in self efficacy score after elementary school teachers have taken the online professional development course. And we also expect to see that teachers in schools that currently have an SEL program in place currently feel more prepared to implement these skills before the professional development when compared with those who do not have a social emotional learning program. So what I mean by that is if schools have an SEL program already, I would expect their self-efficacy levels to be higher than at the beginning of the test, the pre-test, than those teachers who are in schools that do not have social emotional learning. Ethical considerations. This research study will not proceed without the approval of the IRB at the University of the Cumberlands. We'll also be following the Belmont Report as a guideline since we are using human subjects. We'll also be looking at the National Education Association ethical guidelines. We want to pay particular attention to this guidelines because that's the population that we are dealing with. We are working with exclusively people who are teaching currently in elementary school classrooms. So we want to make sure that we are cognizant of any ethical guidelines that they are to uphold, as well as using that as a framework for any of our questions. And I have my references now. And thank you so much.